agree with you there.
I'm just letting everyone in because we're at this 4:30 mark. So sorry to cut you off there, but
no.
Just want to let you know we're going to get started.
What I was going to say is, based on sort of those ideas, then what does that mean for changing how the United States kind of acts in the world? And
and maybe we can get into some of those issues here.
All right, well, as everyone trickles in this afternoon, I'd like to welcome everyone to our first event of the semester. My name is Jasper Boers, and I'm the student president of the Buckley program. I'm excited to welcome all of you to our firing line debate on Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal, and to a brand new semester of in-person classes finally, and a great lineup of Buckley events. With the situation in Afghanistan taking up so much of the national conversation these past few weeks, it's imperative to bring together scholars from different perspectives to discuss the future of the US presence in the Middle East and what the Afghanistan decision means for the future of our grand strategy. We're thrilled to have with us today two experts who have written and spoken on Afghanistan extensively. Before I introduce them, I just want to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference. Our over 350 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now onto our guest today. William Ruger serves as Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. He was previously an associate professor with tenure in the Department of Political Science at Texas State University and an adjunct assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. Ruger is a veteran of the Afghanistan War and was awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal with Campaign Star, and the non-Article 5 NATO Service Medal, among other decorations. He remains an officer in the US Navy Reserve Component, and he was nominated by President Donald Trump to serve as the US Ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and was appointed by the President to the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board in 2020. Rebecca L. Heinrichs is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, specializing in US national defense policy with a focus on strategic deterrence. Heinrichs publishes frequently in leading political magazines and academic journals and regularly provides analysis on cable news and radio programs. She serves as an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics, where she teaches nuclear deterrence theory, and is a staff member of the Defense and Strategic Studies program at Missouri State University. She is also a contributing editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. Heinrich served in the US House of Representatives as an advisor to former Congressman Trent Franks, where she focused on matters related to Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. She was instrumental in starting the Bipartisan Missile Defense Caucus, and prior to her work on defense policy, she was in the oversight staff of the House Judiciary Committee. Regarding the format of today's debate, I'll have each of our guests start with 5 to 10 minute opening statements, after which both of them will have a few minutes to respond to each other. I'll then move into questions from myself and questions from you, our audience, which you can submit throughout the event using the Q&A feature on the lower panel of the Zoom window. At the end, I'll give each guest a few minutes to offer closing remarks, and we'll finish up around 5:30 p.m. So with that, please join me in welcoming Rebecca Heinrichs and William Ruger virtually to Yale and to the Buckley program. And we already decided the order ahead of time, so I'd like to ask Mr. Ruger to begin.
Sure, thanks for having me. So I guess what I would start with is to say that we can't think about Afghan policy, US Afghan policy, without embedding it within the context of what America's foreign policy and America's grand strategy ought to be. Because we shouldn't look at things in isolation. They have to be connected up to the ends of our country, right? The kind of vital national interests of our country, and connected to the ways in which we want to achieve those goals. And when it comes to grand strategy, of course, and Afghanistan, when it comes to military withdrawal, is the relationship of our use of the military tool of statecraft to meeting our vital national security interests. So what I would start with is I look at our national interests. The key national interests we have are the protection of our territorial integrity, right? Our homeland security, our safety here at home. We also have to be concerned about securing the conditions of our economic prosperity. It's not government's job to provide prosperity. It's not very good at doing that. That's why I'm a conservative, if you will. But it can secure the conditions of our prosperity. And that means, for example, having a strong Navy and Air Force and Space Force that can help us command the global commons to make sure that we can, kind of freely navigate at sea and protect our trade routes. So you have to have a strong Navy for that. And then also we want to make sure that our liberal democratic system here at home is secured, because we're not just a regime that protects our homeland, but we want to protect an American way of life, if you will. And that means we have to make sure to be careful about how our military posture affects, say, our civil liberties here at home. Because you can, one of the dangers is when trying to achieve the impossible 100% security, you could actually paradoxically make yourself less secure. And so we have to be careful about that as a liberal democracy. So how does this figure into Afghanistan? Well, we have to think about what are the threats to those three vital national interests. What are the things that we have to either fight against or defend and deter against? And fortunately, the United States, and unfortunately, if you watch Fox News or read the Wall Street Journal, you'd think that the United States was in a terrible security environment in which we should kind of hide under our bed. We're so insecure. But in fact, that's not the case. Now, of course, in an anarchic international system, you always have to be worried about your survival. There's no 911 to call. That's why we have a military. That's why we have to have a defense sector second to none. And why we can't rely on international institutions and international law. Those are not the things that are going to keep us safe. In fact, they might imperil our safety. You could imagine circumstances where that would be true. But we do have a relatively benign security environment relative to great powers throughout history, including the Roman Empire. So we have two big moats between us and the rest of the world. It's very difficult to project power across water. That's still true even if the world is smaller. We have nuclear weapons, and that the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons means our territorial integrity is almost secure, almost completely secure, right? It'd be foolish for any country to attack us as long as we have the credibility, commitment, and capability of a nuclear deterrent. We also have a strong military, a strong Navy, a strong Air Force that can keep people far away from our shores in terms of state actors. And the Eurasian balance of power is not at threat. Even though Russia and China are clearly great powers or near great powers that we need to worry about, the fact is that the Eurasian balance of power that the United States traditionally, when it came to World War I and World War II, we worried about, there's lots of reasons to think that the balances will result in Europe with some nudging by us, but not much, right? Because of the natural propensity of states to balance against threatening states, like China, for example. And so that means that when we think about what are some of the threats that relate to Afghanistan, one of them is obviously terrorism, right? So terrorist organizations with the intent and capability to harm the United States are things we should worry about, because those are one of the things that are challenges, and we know that given 9/11 and what happened afterwards. And that means we have to have the willpower to strike those types of terrorists anywhere they are in the globe. We have to have the intelligence capabilities to do that. But I don't believe we have to have a permanent military presence in any of these countries in order to do that. In fact, we would have to garrison so much of the planet if any place where there could be a terrorist operating was a place we had to have a permanent military presence, or a nation building project to build this kind of, obviously when it comes to Afghanistan, impossible idealistic task of building a more liberal democratic regime there, or even a central regime. We don't need to do that. We can use over the horizon capabilities. We can use special operations forces. We can use even punitive raids as necessary to deal with those types of threats anywhere in the world, including Afghanistan. So let's get to Afghanistan, right? So we needed to do three things in Afghanistan after 9/11. We needed to punish the Taliban for its state support of al-Qaeda. We needed to decimate al-Qaeda as an effective terrorist organization with the intent and capability to harm us. And we needed to kill or capture Osama bin Laden. And we achieved all three of those goals a long time ago. So we actually kind of won the war we needed to fight. And the problem is that we expanded the war aims And then we lost that war. We Christmas treed our approach there. We added so many ornaments to that. Democracy promotion, promotion of women's rights, education policy, centralization, building state capacity, counter drug operations. We did try to do so many things, and most of those were impossible or they contradicted each other. And that's when we kind of our strategy went awry. And that happened early. That happened under George W. Bush. It was intensified by President Obama. And I think, fortunately, President Trump realized at a certain point that, look, we don't need to do those things. That's not necessary. And that we can accomplish our goals in terms of counterterrorism without being there. And so I was somebody who did support the Doha agreement that President Trump signed, and and I'd also supported President Biden's ultimate decision after dithering a bit, deciding to fulfill the essential aspects of the Doha agreement, although delayed. And I think that delay was costly. But I think they did the right thing because, like I said before, the biggest concern in the world for us when it comes from Afghanistan is merely the threat of terrorist organizations. And we can do that without being there permanently. Because again, we have to keep our eyes on some of the biggest challenges to those vital interests I talked about at the beginning, the rise of China and how to deal with that effectively, neither too hot nor too cold, the rise, any kind of terrorist organizations around the globe, we have to keep an eye on. Those aren't necessarily existential threats, but they are threats that are at the top of our list, and we need to deal with those with our military. And then defending and deterring. Now, when it comes to some of the issues like China, Pakistan, India, Iran, right? I think that these countries aren't foolish enough to try to have a long-term project of remaking Afghanistan. And if they do, we should probably, kind of silently applaud that, because they, like us and the Soviets and the British before them, will find that Afghanistan isn't worth the price of admission. And if they leave it alone, fine, because admittedly, Afghanistan is a strategic backwater. It just doesn't matter that much, except for the issue, like I said before. And a big problem with 9/11 is that before that, we didn't have the willpower to take on some of these organizations like Al-Qaeda. And even then, it was a close run affair. There was a chance in which we would have actually had bin Laden turned over by the Afghan government under the Taliban to the Saudis. And look what history would have said about that. Look how history would have been changed. So again, we accomplished what we needed to in Afghanistan, especially when it came to securing our vital interests. And then we added these things that are not vital interests or are contradictory or work against those interests when it came to Afghanistan. And so we could safely leave. Now, how we implemented the withdrawal, I think could come in for great criticism. I'm not sure how you could look at the last 20 days without seeing that. But the ultimate withdrawal decision, the Trump-Biden withdrawal decision, I think was wise. And I would defend that to the hilt. It was the right policy move. And I think that it was we should have done it long ago. And we need to have accountability for the architects of our 20-year war, our America's longest war. We need to have accountability for them, not just the people responsible for the debacle of the evacuation over the last 20 years, but the architects of this policy, the generals and the admirals and the civilian leaders who misled us. And I would really encourage people to read the Afghanistan papers published by the Washington Post and now in book form, because it shows you how these architects misled the American public and how they really had no clue about how to achieve strategic success when it came to those expanded war aims. So I'll end there before my 10 minutes are up and yield to Rebecca, who I'm sure will have some great things to say.
Thank you so much. That was well stated. There's a lot, I think, mostly that we agree with maybe in the first part. And I've actually structured my remarks to handle the sort of what is the U.S. priorities, what are the U.S. priorities, and what is the U.S. grand strategy, and then how Afghanistan fits into that. So first of all, I do want to thank my hosts for hosting this debate and for all of the students who are interested in being here and for their commitment to a free exchange of ideas, which is fundamental to a free society. So well done to all of you who are doing this and who are engaged on this conversation. Now, so because I do think that debates often gloss over some fundamental assumptions, I'm just going to go ahead and put forward what I believe to be the U.S. Where we are is sort of in a timeline of the U.S. role in the world, and then what this means for Afghanistan. Number one, the responsibility of the U.S. government is to provide for the defense of the American people and to secure our way of life, the American way of life. Two, the United States still leads a post-World War II order due to our power, both economic and military, and the character of our country. Now, this order is in the security interests of Americans, and if the US does not fight for it, it will be led by a more powerful countries whose regime and character will dictate what it is like. Three, the United States no longer sits at the apex of its power for a variety of reasons. Most fundamental, I believe, was this myth that many influential elites had that major competition was a thing of the past, that we had simply left it in the dustbin of history and sort of had evolved from that. And it was really rooted in an idealistic view, I think, of fallen human nature and how states work, too much trust in international institutions, and this belief that there was this more benign rules-based order that was operating simply by these nice notions of the good. In fact, it was guided by and directed by and influenced by American strength and influence. And then, of course, our diplomatic work with our allies and partners who would prefer a world influenced by and primarily led by the United States than alternatives. Now, it is my view that the Trump administration, despite its flaws, yielded great progress in waking people up to this reality, challenged a lot of beliefs that were still kind of coasting, shared by both Republicans and Democrats about the threats to the United States, and then made great progress in reorienting our priorities and our policies to take on those threats. The biggest one, of course, is the Chinese Communist Party is now contesting the United States in earnest and seeking to supplant the United States, not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but globally. It is the primary threat to the United States, and it must be the US government's number one priority. It should impact and order how we think about the United States' interactions in the world generally. And it's going to take a whole of government approach to do this. And then Russia, also a major power, is the little brother, is kind of how I view the relationship of China. And then when there are opportunities, the two of them cooperate to undermine the United States. It is for these reasons that I have been sympathetic to a drawdown in Afghanistan. Not because I naively believe that the threat of terrorism has gone away, but because the mission there grew to one that was broad, open-ended, and rooted in the same kind of idealism that caused us to lose a relative superiority that we inherited after the Cold War. Now, ideological rigidity trapped us there so that we could not let go the possibility that our efforts were leading that nation to a sovereign, independent democracy. And I know there's still people that said that we weren't really doing nation building. You can see now that we're going back through and seeing all of the different things that we were doing that were really rooted in idealism, on gender coaching. And I mean, it was just as recent as June that the United States was flying the LGBTQ flag in Kabul. So there's lots of things that the United States was trying to do to press upon this country, this austere Muslim country that never took hold over the 20 years that we were there. As recently as 2019, I said that investing fewer resources and energy in Afghanistan would necessarily free up the United States. Now, I don't buy this notion that we just need to turn our back to the world and just invest in it home, but we should shore up our military strength to take on the major powers in which we are now engaged in major competition, China and Russia. A lot of what we were doing in our military planning and our energies were focused on these long counterterrorism operations, and were not focused on what was necessary to deter both China and Russia in their respective theaters. However, when the Trump administration began pressuring the Department of Defense to make further cuts to troop to force levels, it became very clear to me, as I sat through some of these briefings as well, that the basic need to maintain counterterrorism, this notion we keep hearing about over the horizon capability, was was not going to be sufficient if we didn't have at least a small presence in country. Okay, so 2021. So we can go back and rehash when we should have done things different in 2004, 2005, 2010, 2014, all different, I think, inflection points in our campaign there. But now, knowing what the country's priorities are, what should be done, and then I became convinced that our position should be ending the democracy building efforts, anything we were doing that is not our vital interest, which was maintaining stability there through supporting the Afghan National Security Forces. Really, since 2014, 2015, the end of the Obama administration, we began moving to just providing air support to the Afghan army. They took casualties. I think the number is 65,000 is what is the number that is being cited quite a bit of the number of Afghans who died since then in this campaign, while the United States was really just advising them and directing them and providing air support. And I became convinced that, although this would possibly not have been my position even 6, 7, 8 years ago, that Bagram Air Base now would be valuable in our competition with China, that giving up Bagram Air Base would be an unnecessary concession because of its location adjacent to and having NATO troops being able to work with the United States bordering China as our #1 priority. And that would take care of two things: conducting counterterrorism to keep Americans safe, and then also preventing the loss of Bagram Air Base, which could be very helpful. Now, what I am insisting on here then is that there's a principle here at play that I think that Professor Ruger and I agree with some of these principles here, that the United States must prioritize the security of the American people, that we must be extremely disciplined in what is achievable and what can actually be done with our military, what it is meant for. And but we have to take those principles and then, as new facts come up, to apply them in a way that is prudent. We should be flexible in how we think about this. And then again, going back to that point about within line of the character of the United States, which I think is important, especially as we are engaged in this major power competition and we need allies and partners to be working with the United States. So keeping Bagram there with our NATO allies would permit us to do those things. Now, I want to move into the second piece of the withdrawal itself, because I think that this is where I think I've just been astounded at watching this unravel before us the last couple of weeks. It's been jarring as an American citizen, frankly, to watch the failure of sound judgment of President Biden and what I would describe as ideological rigidity and his inability to change what he was doing or to change his mind as facts changed and contested and challenged what he had previously believed to be true or what would happen when he made different decisions. So to wrap up my remarks, I'm just going to, well, not really wrap up. I'm gonna go through just briefly all of the decisions that President Biden made that resulted in compounding problems for the United States. 1, President Biden did not leave the door open for a credible threat of force if a single American was harmed during the withdrawal, like President Trump had done. That did have a deterrent effect, I think, on the Taliban's behavior. That to me was not there. And so it was a very precarious situation. Number 2, the August 31 deadline was self-imposed. It was arbitrary. Number 3, Biden did not accept the Taliban's offer to the US for the US to secure Kabul. Instead, Biden seemed to have been so ideologically rigid and motivated by that August 31st deadline and to not send in more troops for this withdrawal that he did not agree that the United States would secure Kabul. And instead, he gave the military the choice of only sufficient troops to pick Bagram or the airport. And of course, we all know that they picked the airport rather than the much more secure Bagram Air Base that had that prison with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of terrorists, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Biden blames Trump for the conditions of the deal, but he did not have to follow them. Thus, he could have kept Bagram as a necessary condition for continuing special operations, which the Trump team did want to have as a condition that we would continue doing special operations and counterterrorism should the threat demand it. Once the Taliban began sweeping the country, Biden did not change course. He remained committed to his plan, which did not include, at this initial withdrawal plans, an evacuation plan for all of our civs, who I believe we have a duty and a commitment to get them to safety. These are Afghans, not all Afghans stuck with the United States. Many of them were bought over by the Taliban. The civs who are there are individuals who bet on the United States and NATO, and we have a moral obligation to make sure that they are safe. In other words, the plan by default was to leave American citizens and our NATO allies' citizens, regardless of whether or not they could get out, and the civs there. If you don't have a plan to remove them all, then your plan necessarily was to keep them there. Number 6, Biden did not seek to minimize the use of weapons sufficiently. Now, I know that they disarmed some of the military equipment, but there was lots and lots and lots of military equipment that was left behind, including some the ability of the Taliban to access biometrics of the civs that are left in the country. Number 7, Biden did not cooperate closely with NATO. We know this because our NATO allies are absolutely having a fit about this. Biden rebuffed European requests to extend the August 31st deadline so that allies would be able to airlift the remaining citizens and Afghan allies out of Kabul. The UK Parliament issued a rebuke of the President of the United States. The Biden administration relied on and continues to rely on the Taliban for intelligence. Now, some people might say that's just going to be the best we can do, but that was not my understanding of the previous administration's plan for how we were going to rely on intelligence, which might explain why we ended up droning innocent children on our way out in retaliation for the attack that killed 13 of our military service members and many other Afghans who were trying to get on that airplane. We clearly did not have good intelligence that we were basing that drone strike on. So the diplomatic fallout from this, combined with the fact that we are now essentially blind to the terrorism activity in Afghanistan, makes the United States much weaker diplomatically to take on China and Russia, the other countries in which we need our allies and partners to do more to help the United States deter their acts of aggression against our shared interests, and it places Americans at significant risk because of our lack of eyes on the ground that we can trust. And I think it's the ideological inflexibility was a deadly error for those who wanted to expand the mission in Afghanistan to try to set up a democracy. And I think it's ideological inflexibility on the part of President Biden that he was unable to make changes that would be actually in the best interest of the American people based on the circumstances which were ongoing as he took office. And so it was that ideological inflexibility that is the deadly error, and that those who cheer even the precipitous withdrawal that we just witnessed and the humiliating behavior of the American president that he seems to be defiantly defensive of, and not showing any kind of contrition or regret for any of the mistakes that he has made. And with that, I look forward to a back and forth and the questions from the audience.
Mr. Ruger, I'll give you a few minutes to respond.
Sure, and again, there's a lot to like in what Rebecca said, but I do like we talked about earlier. I do want to hone in on the things that we disagreed with, just because that's more interesting, and you'll know what we do agree on since you heard both of our talks. And again, there's a lot of that, and adults can disagree about these things, and I think that's one of the problems of a lot of our politics today is that this kind of forum that Yale has doesn't happen as much as it should. And I don't think Rebecca and I will get to the shouting and the ad hominems, because I think we're both adults and want to kind of get to the truth together. So I appreciate what you said, Rebecca. So one of the things that I would say about the argument about keeping a kind of rump force there to defend or help support counterterrorism operations and the government of Afghanistan is that I don't think that it was sustainable. So my argument would be that a small number of forces there would not have been able to prevent the operational and tactical momentum that the Taliban had, and that would have eventually, I think, led to a kind of admittedly slower loss, but ultimately us being in the same situation, but potentially with more troops on the ground. The other thing is that the reason why Americans hadn't been targeted since February of 2020 was because of the Doha Agreement, in which we had agreed to withdraw fully, not leaving anyone there. And so the Trump deal was that we would leave completely. There was no provision in the agreement for us to maintain any troops there or to maintain Bagram. And so we would have been targeted. And in my mind, I would really worry about what would have happened if, say, we were at Bagram and the Taliban had essentially created a condition in which we would have been essentially sitting in a landlocked country trying to hold a small military base. I mean, Bagram's a big military base, but it's a small piece of Afghanistan. And that could have led to a very bad situation, even worse than other situations in which armies have been surrounded. So I would have really worried about that. I would also say that we couldn't have maintained 2,500 troops to do counterterrorism and defended the Afghan government. In order to help the Afghan government, required us to have much more troops. I mean, the coalition had 150,000 troops there during the surge, and oftentimes had tens of thousands of troops and contractors there. And so in order to support a government that was still losing ground, we would have had to expanded the war massively. The Taliban would have seen us as breaking our agreement. And so we would have, I think, been subject to more and more Americans being killed there. And we would have had to come to the rescue of the government, thus not actually doing the counterterrorism mission, but continuing to do a support to the government of Afghanistan, building the state capacity, which we know as the Afghan military faded away so quickly, that was a lost project, that we weren't successful in doing that. So I think we could not have sustainably stayed there. And then the question again is, do you actually need to do counterterrorism from the ground? And I would say you could do it over the horizon. But my strongest point, I think, there is that we could not have done counterterrorism there on the ground with the force we had, because the Taliban was not going to accept it. And the government of Afghanistan, as we saw proven out, could not hold the country. It simply was not possible. And so I think we had to leave. And I think President Trump and President Biden both recognized that. So I'm in the strange situation of actually being to the, into the more Trumpian side of Rebecca on this issue, where President Trump did not want us to stay. In fact, we were going to go down to zero by May 1st, which would have been better. And that's where maybe Rebecca and I could find some agreement is, if we were going to leave Afghanistan, we should have left according to the Trump negotiated deal, and that it wasn't hasty, because February 2020 to May 1st of 2021 was a long time. And unfortunately, the Pentagon and others dragged their feet on this project of getting us out of America's longest war and concentrating on our domestic and foreign priorities that were much more important.
So if I could just a couple of points. Some of what Professor Ruger just said is based on what we think may have happened or may not have happened. So it's hard to argue against something that we didn't have a chance to see if it would play out. But a couple of points I think are important. One, I agree that the Afghan government was incredibly weak and was dependent on the United States being there to support the army. That was what we could see it collapse. But what I think is important to keep in mind is, and you've seen this from some of the generals from the Afghan army who have written in the pages of American newspapers now to explain, we trained the Afghan army in how to fight and conduct operations based on how the United States did that. They were very reliant on American close air support. They were very reliant on the United States talking in their ear and actually giving them direction. And so when we removed that immediately, it had an enormous collapse of morale. So I don't mean to suggest that I think that we were anywhere near to the point where Afghanistan was close to a sovereign democratic nation without us. What I mean to say is that we actually were able to continue to conduct pretty successful counterterrorism operations throughout Afghanistan, where the Afghan army was still doing the bulk of the dangerous groundwork. And that's really been the case since 2014, 2015 kind of timeframe. The surge also, I want to say, that I think most people would agree. I don't that was a failure, that the surge was a failure. So I'm not suggesting that we would return to the attempts of the Obama administration's surge. I don't think that, and if their expansive mission and what they were trying to achieve is much broader than what I'm suggesting here too. And then the other point I think is important is I still, this over the horizon hope that the United States is still going to have this. I used to think I used to hope and think that that was the case earlier on in the Trump administration, but I had so many briefings about how reliant we are on our Afghan allies and sources that were in country that have now been totally scattered. And we really are, if you listen to the Biden administration talk, they're talking about the Taliban government now as though this is going to be a partner with the United States against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And these are people we were just at war with just a few weeks ago. And so I am again, going back to the fact that we were relying on or using Taliban intelligence for this last drone strike, I think that's already evidence in the other column that we are not going to have sufficient good, sound intelligence to continue to destroy terrorists. The other thing I would just say too about this is not a defense of Donald Trump himself, but in terms of his difference, everyone wants to conflate both Biden and Trump on this. The thing about Donald Trump, though, that was different, and to his credit, he was very pragmatic. And when given different information, and especially on the point whenever there was an increasing terrorism threat, he was very willing to employ force, very willing to use force. That's not something that we saw from the Biden administration when you saw the Taliban just totally taking over the country, and Joe Biden just stuck with that plan rather than, I think, reasserting the American control of the situation and determining the parameters. Remember, the Taliban wanted us to leave. It was amazing to me that the Biden administration just gave so much leverage over to the Taliban when it was the Taliban who had wanted us to leave. We had a lot more leverage to make better decisions. But again, it just goes back to that point, though, where I just disagree that the United States needed to completely withdraw. And you've got all these NATO allies that are saying the same thing and had a lot of the same shared intelligence that we were giving with them. And they were not confident that we had an over-horizon capability in place before this withdrawal commenced either. And so, I still think that we have a real problem, and we're going to have a lot of pieces of the diplomatic fallout from this in order to do what we all want to do, which is to work with our allies to hold the line and deter and defend against our shared threats.
Thank you. So we'll move into some questions now, but I want to just get to a note about the over the horizon capabilities. We have a few questions from the audience for you, Mr. Ruger, about what, practically speaking, an over the horizon capability looks like, whether we kind of have those resources, and why we shouldn't use air assets to sort of augment our special forces there as well. And more generally, how would you sort of address this?
Yeah, I guess what I would say in response is that I'm in favor of doing counterterrorism missions, but you don't need to have a permanent military presence to do those. I mean, if you go with the idea that we needed to have a permanent military presence, even assuming we could, because again, I'm not gonna accept the notion that we could have maintained, say, air assets at Bagram in a country that was going to eventually fall to the Taliban. These would have been sitting ducks. And so I don't accept that we could have maintained a small force. We would have needed to have a large force, and we were already losing, right, in terms of our control of the country. So again, I think that we can do it. But my broader point is that we have to do counterterrorism missions all over the world, potentially, wherever there are terrorist organizations with the intent and capability to harm us. And we don't have permanent military presences in these countries. We don't have a big military footprints. We don't have a Bagram in Niger. We don't have a Bagram in Somalia. We don't have a Bagram in Ethiopia. We don't have a Bagram in any of these countries, and yet we are still required to do what we need to, and we can. And part of that is because, again, large footprints don't help. What large footprints are meant to do are to protect the government, the host government, which was falling apart. And according to this kind of view, I think that you could hold Bagram and protect against Jarrah falling. That was just going to require a big footprint. And so I just think that ultimately what we have to do is we have to work with the realities on the ground in places and make sure we do this. And we can do this. We have drone capabilities. We can use close air support in support of SOF. But the fact is that having that, again, permanent military presence was going to always attract the Taliban to basically use against the government of Afghanistan as a pawn of the West, and also that eventually we were going to lose. I mean, I guess my question for Rebecca and others is do you believe that the United States, given what had been happening over the years in which the Taliban kept gaining more and more ground, and the problems of the government of Afghanistan were not being solved, which was massive endemic corruption, problems in terms of creating a effective military. And yes, while thousands of Afghans did die fighting the Taliban, this was not a very capable military. And in fact, as Jason Dempsey has talked about, we created the wrong military. We tried to recreate a military that was more like create a military more like ourselves, as opposed to creating something that was much more, I think, coherent for the Afghan situation. And so again, there's so many variables at play that the government of Afghanistan just was not sustainable, and therefore our presence was not sustainable. And we had to choose between Trump's withdrawal or a massive increase in our footprint there. And I don't think anybody wanted that. And Rebecca, I hope you'll agree with me on this, because I think that any Republican, I think, has no brief for how our allies frequently behave in reality as opposed to in practice, which is, this is one of the reasons why President Trump went after the Europeans on burden sharing, is that our allies are always trying to free ride on the United States. They don't spend enough money on their military. And then when they go to war with us, they have these national caveats that prevent them from actually playing in the same way that we do. Now, that's not always the case. The UK, right, Australia, other countries, Canada in particular, and down in Kandahar, they were effective partners. But ultimately, the case is that if these countries actually wanted to kind of do what they wanted in Afghanistan and wanted to complain about us leaving, well, there's nothing stopping the rich, prosperous countries from doing this, right? The European countries are more populous, combined, and wealthier than the United States. If they think it's so important to, protect human rights in Helmand, more power to them. They could do that. But we have other problems, like dealing with the rise of China and domestic problems at home. And so I'm not much in for staying in a war that expanded war aims that we were losing, that I do not believe was sustainable, and that took our time, energy, and attention from other things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say there is I think that there's multiple false choices and that you just outlined. I mean, I would say, first of all, I would absolutely agree that our allies and partners need to be doing more. I think that the Trump administration was very successful at making that an important point. And NATO actually, from my perspective, actually grew stronger through the Trump administration because of the pressure that was put on there and convincing them all these different ways in which they need to contribute more to their own security and to the security of the alliance. So I think, as painful as it was for a lot of people, the alliance was in a better position at the end of the Trump administration in real terms. What Joe Biden did and the way he did this did more to undermine the NATO alliance than anything that Donald Trump ever said to offend Angela Merkel. And it comes down to, though, not just the withdrawal. I think for years we've been saying that the United States wants to shrink our presence, shrink our mission, and then you had people saying we want to totally get out of there. But so NATO was aware of that, but there was not an over-the-horizon plan in place when this precipitous withdrawal began to unwind. And then President Biden didn't even take the calls of the heads of state of our NATO allies to explain what was going on, and then remained defiant and lacking in communication as the whole thing unwound, when it's their citizens who are in harm's way as well. So I think it was just this total absence of American leadership. I agree that I think our allies and partners should continue to be encouraged to do more. But how you go about it mattered in the Trump administration. How you go about it matters in the Biden administration. And again, even if on paper you say, well, look, they can do this and we can do this and we shouldn't have to do this. And they could, not everybody, we're still people, we're not Vulcans, right? And so the trust that people have in one another and in the leadership of other countries matters a great deal. And so I do think that the way this withdrawal was carried out was very, very detrimental to the United States and now our ability, and it is going to have an impact. Some of the things Joe Biden said was that this, he put a lot of blame at the foot of the Afghan army for their inability to hold off the Taliban. But it was a series of things that the United States did that also put them in that position. I'm not taking away from the fact that the Afghan army wasn't better than they were. But remember, these were illiterate men who came to us, who we were training, and we trained them in a way that they were reliant on us. The other thing about the Afghan, the other point I think is a counter that I don't quite agree with, is this notion that it was inevitable and that we're going to have like a Benghazi times 1,000 if we kept Bagram. You know, this little it's a sprawling base, this base there that was eventually going to be surrounded and maybe attacked by the Taliban. The United States with our NATO allies from 2015 was, I mean, I guess I would lower our expectations and say it was pretty, things were going pretty well in terms of our counterterrorism efforts, in terms of keeping the Taliban from completely taking over, which is why, though I was not surprised that a total withdrawal was going to result in the Taliban taking over so quickly, I think that the rapid speed at which they took over really did surprise the political leaders inside the Biden administration. But again, just as it completely deflated the morale of our Afghan partners whenever we immediately stopped providing support, it inflated the morale and the motivation and energy of the Taliban at the same time, which is why you saw this combination of things happening simultaneously. I guess I would just say we know what would have happened if we had not done this, and it's what was happening up until we did this for many, many years. Now, some people look at that and say, right, it's a disaster. And some people look at it and say, none of the situations were great. And so you have to choose what situation you want out of the situations we have. And we did have counterterrorism. We did have sources in the ground. We did have this base. We were working with our partners. And so I don't think that the only choice we had was a total withdrawal, and one, especially not one that was as poorly planned out as the Biden administration's.
So I guess my question is then, if everything was going relatively swimmingly, right? We had a sustainable presence in your view. Why did President Trump, of all people, want to withdraw fully from that country and sign the Doha Agreement? Because the fact is that the war was not going well, and that he realized, and I think wisely, that we were no longer going to have American boys and girls dying in a war that we were eventually going to leave, and where eventually things were going to unravel one way or the other. And I think that's why staying was only going to delay the inevitable. And I think that, look, I served there in uniform in 2008, 2009. And I look at it and I think if people were callous about my life and the life of the fellow troops that were there, because all that we were doing there was helping make sure that it was a slow loss as opposed to a fast loss, I think that's disrespecting the troops. And you see people like Richard Haas talking about this, about how, we were slowly losing, but we still have to do this. I just think I think that is not the approach that the president should take. I think we knew what we needed to do in Afghanistan, and we determined that we could do that perfectly fine, just like we do in lots of other countries in the greater Middle East, which is without having a permanent large military presence. And that Afghanistan was not special, right? You can conduct terrorist operations and plan them from so many other places in the globe that Afghanistan isn't crucial. Think about 9/11. Where were the pilots trained for 9/11? Florida. Where were a lot of these people engaged in? Europe, right? So counterterrorism is something that has to take place across the globe, and terrorists don't need Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, it actually isn't all that great a place to conduct operations against the United States from. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have to be vigilant about it, but again, we don't need a permanent military presence defending a corrupt, ineffective government, a government that did not share our values. And we didn't need to do that in order to meet our counterterrorism goals. And I guess that's the kind of thing that we're disagreeing about. And it's perfectly fine to disagree like adults, is around whether it was worth spending American lives and billions of dollars to stay in Afghanistan for what ultimately was going to be a loss. And again, that's why, again, I'm on President Trump's side here. He said a full withdrawal because it was no longer in America's national interests.
Yeah, I just, on that point too, again, I'm not at all here to defend President Trump. I would just say, though, this is why the Pompeo and Trump approach, my understanding too, was that it was conditions-based. And now you can say the conditions-based because it really provided the United States with a set of conditions at which they could always pragmatically dial up or dial down what they were doing and to change course. It was much more ideologically wasn't ideological at all. It was a policy, a decision that was still going to permit them to make decisions based on the ground and what they were seeing. And you still see former officials talking about how the plan was always to continue to conduct counterterrorism. So I guess what I would say is, we cannot be ideologically inflexible both on this expanding mission, democracy building, nor on the removing the United States totally from Afghanistan. I would agree with you that the United States can still conduct counterterrorism operations in various places, but those are different countries with different sets of circumstances, and so you have to deal with the situation you have before you. I'm also actually thrilled to hear you say that we should still be conducting counterterrorism operations in some of those African countries and other places in the Middle East. I think that the United States has to be forward-leaning in that. It's a real national security challenge. One thing I wanted to actually sort of agree with you, but kind of put it in a different way. I also agree, part of the just war tradition, of which the West still largely bases how we think about how to act responsibly in war, when to engage in war, and how to carry out a war, is that it's not just that the cause has to be just, it's that there has to be a reasonable belief that we can actually achieve it. And so for that reason, I actually think those who were focusing so much on the human rights point that was really rooted in idealism and naivety about what the US military was really up for the task for, though they made very moralistic arguments for that. I actually thought that because it actually was not. I don't think that my husband and my sons should be sent to a war to protect the women of which their husbands and brothers and fathers were not willing to protect. Solely that in and of itself is not solely enough to send American troops to go to war. So I agree on that point. Having said that, what I've been arguing for, though, is a strictly national security perspective that would prevent exactly what we're seeing now. We can see what will happen when the United States totally withdraws. I've talked to people who supported a total withdrawal who now are watching and saying they've got buyer's remorse in terms of what they've watched happen. You still have former Trump officials who say this is not how Donald Trump would have responded if these things would have happened. It would have gone much differently, or they would have changed course, they would have reversed, they would have extended the deadline. And so I guess I'm just not convinced that this was just the only way before us, that we only had expanding the mission, much more vulnerable there, many more Americans dying, or what we're watching now. Last point I would say, 13 American service members died because of this withdrawal. It was the most American casualties that we've had in Afghanistan in a decade. And so it is not always true that simply removing ourselves from a situation is going to result in saved and preserved American lives, that we can make foolish decisions that lead to the tragic deaths of Americans, which I believe, their deaths, they were there for carrying out their duty and doing it so well. And they were really let down by those who were commanding them and their political leaders who devised this really terrible plan.
Yeah, they were definitely brave, and we should honor them. But what I would say, though, is that 2,400 Americans were killed in Afghanistan since we started. Mm-hmm. And so if we stayed, there would have been many more Americans killed. And what I would say is that the virtue of a full withdrawal is that there will be no American troops killed in Afghanistan with this full withdrawal. And again, you could mourn the scenes on the ground, but the fact is that the President of the United States is responsible for the national security of our country, and to protect those troops and only put them in harm's way when it supports our national interests. Since I believe that we did not need a permanent military presence there to do the counterterrorism mission, but you would require that to uphold this slowly losing, corrupt, and ineffective government, I think it's great that we're out fully. Even though it's messy on the ground.
I don't mean to jump in
no
here.
Americans will die there any longer on the ground in Afghanistan. No American troops, because we're gone.
I don't mean to jump in here, but I just want to get to another audience question before we have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. So obviously the withdrawal is done. What we've left behind, we've left behind. We're probably not going back in sort of a substantial way. So in terms of managing the conflict that might occur in Afghanistan, and in terms of managing kind of the Taliban government, do you see any other conflict hot zones For example, one audience member notes the Korean Peninsula, where we've had success in kind of managing remaining troop presence and kind of managing conflict where it exists. But do you see any lessons kind of from America's recent history in terms of how we should go about in the future handling the situation in Afghanistan?
Do you want to take that one first and then I'll hop on?
Sure. Well, I think that you've seen, and it just surprises me, some of the people that I really thought are intelligent commentators on foreign policy have talked about the comparison between Afghanistan and Germany, Japan, and South Korea. And I find this to be sophism, because the fact is that I've served in Germany in uniform since the war on terrorism started. And I have complete freedom of movement there. I can walk around the whole place. I can go to great cultural sites. No one plants IEDs. There's not a full-on insurgency trying to attack our bases there. We don't have to go out with our body armor on and armed. Again, Germany is, since 1945, Germany has been a place where there's not an active civil war. Same thing with Japan. Afghanistan is a place where there's an active insurgency that has been killing Americans every year for 20 years there. It is not comparable. So maintaining a presence in Afghanistan is nothing like Germany. We would not be able to go, even if we just held Bagram, if we could do that, we would not be able to go to Kabul or Mazar-e Sharif or Herat and go to the carpet markets like you can go to, the Wursthaus in Germany. You could not drive around the country without being blown up by IEDs. This is a situation that there's just not a comparison. We are in an active civil war in which the other side has the upper hand in killing Americans on a daily basis, I believe, if we went back and restarted this war. So I think you could be like Rebecca and argue for the war in Afghanistan, but you're arguing for a war, not a friendly presence in Germany and Japan, in which we're allies and in which there's no one trying to kill us on a daily basis.
Thank you. Ms. Hendricks.
Yeah, I actually just have a question too, though. One point on this last remark. I would just say, though we might not have any American soldiers killed in Afghanistan anymore, we still have American citizens there. We still have civs there who are very much at risk right now in a country crawling with terrorists. And the other thing I would say too is, from my perspective, I don't see how anybody could even say that the threat to Americans here now has not gone up. I mean, that seems to be, even if you think that the risk is worth it to get out of Afghanistan, I'd be curious to hear if you would agree that the risk to Americans, to my family and to American citizens here at home has gone up. I'd actually do kind of want your answer to that. And then the other thing is, just as you said before, we have plenty, you can't go to the market in all kinds of places where we're conducting counterterrorism operations in African countries and throughout the Middle East. These are inherently dangerous situations. However, when you hear people using the rhetoric like Americans dying all the time, like President Biden, it's like President Biden got his last intelligence briefing at the surge in 2010 and went to sleep and woke up. And now he's basing his information on the number of Americans who are dying and at that tempo because of the surge that the Obama administration carried out. It's simply not what was going on in Afghanistan in recent years. And so again, I just want to challenge students and those listening here. It's not a binary choice, that we need to be flexible, have these principles and make decisions as our interests, are still important to us that we want to carry out, but as the facts on the ground change. I'm very much still worried that we're going to now be going back into Afghanistan again, because there's going to be another attack. And I don't want to be relying on the Taliban for our intelligence, which is so far seems to be the plan of this administration. It's the only plan they've left over. And so my other question is, would you support going back into Afghanistan if we do have another attack on the United States homeland, again, from an al-Qaeda cell that is integrated in with the Taliban government?
Yeah, I've said that I'm in favor of using our military power as necessary to hit terrorist organizations. And again, I think that that could be anywhere they are, right? And you could even use punitive raids. So Gil Barndollar in the Wall Street Journal talked about how you can use punitive raids. But what we do not need is to garrison the country and try to get involved in the nation building. Again, this I think flows from conservatism. We know that government isn't, right? The military isn't good at promoting the kinds of things that we were talking about as being necessary to uphold that government, right? We weren't solving the problem with our military that was endemic within the government of Afghanistan, which allowed it to be unpopular and ultimately considered to be illegitimate by the people, or lacking in legitimacy, right? It's the corruption. It's the massive, I think, kind of attempt by the mayor of Kabul, if you will, to try to impose his rule on places that weren't going to accept it. So again, I think that we could meet those goals without us being there, so it's not an issue of whether I believe in counterterrorism. I do. It's just that we don't need to. And again, I think that's consistent with what President Trump wanted, and I think consistent with what President Biden decided. And we shouldn't confuse the evacuation, the messiness of that, with with how the decision was proper and good.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're at the 5:30 mark. I know you wanted to get your last point in, Ms. Heinrichs, but I think people are hungry to go to dinner. So I really appreciate both of you taking the time to sit down with me today. I think this was a really substantive discussion, and I hope our audience members also got a lot out of it. Sorry we couldn't do it in person, but it feels as if it was just as good over Zoom. So I want to thank you all and have a good evening.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank my fellow debater. She's great and has a lot to say that's important for our kind of future of American foreign policy.
And I would just add, thank you so much for this opportunity. It was really wonderful. Appreciated the discussion, and of course, thank you so much for your service. I appreciate it very much, and it really adds a lot of meaning to the conversation. So, thank you all very much.
Thank you.